9 months ago, a heavy manila envelope landed on my kitchen table. The paper felt too stiff under my fingers, cold from the October air outside, and it smelled faintly of stale coffee and printer ink. A man named Grant Mercer had just set it there. He was a licensed fraud investigator, and his presence alone made the quiet in my apartment feel incredibly heavy. Grant looked at me from across the table. "Your sister claims you stole her diamond bracelet." I was 38 years old. I spent my days coordinating schedules and ordering medical supplies at a community clinic. People trusted me with their health records, their appointments, and their children. Now, my own sister had sent an investigator to my door. "Open it," Grant told me. My wrist still ached, a dull throb radiating from the exact spot where the security guards had grabbed me 3 days ago at the wedding. I peeled the seal back and pulled out a stack of copied papers. Inside was the official insurance claim Ashley had filed. "What time did you arrive at the venue on Saturday?" Grant asked. I did not have to guess. The parking garage machine had printed a ticket right as I pulled in out of the rain. 8:43. Grant pointed to a highlighted line on the paper. "Your sister stated the bracelet went missing at 8:10. She filed a claim for $42,000. He then slid a blurry photograph across the table. It was a still frame from the lobby security camera. There I was, walking through the front doors, shaking water off my coat. The digital timestamp in the corner read exactly 8:43. "Her timeline does not add up," Grant said. He warned me right away that a wrong timeline did not prove she made it all up. People panic, and they get confused about time. I needed to give an exact statement, and he made it clear I could not go talk to any witnesses to argue my case. I had to let the process play out. I touched the fading bruise on my arm, and the memory of Saturday night pulled me right back into that ballroom. It had been a freezing, miserable evening. A constant autumn drizzle washed over the Ohio suburbs, turning the roads slick. I was late to the converted train station where the reception was held because Aunt Linda had experienced car trouble on the highway. I drove out of my way to pick her up. It was just a habit I had formed over the years. Whenever someone in the family had a problem, they called me, and I simply handled it. When Linda and I finally walked into the warm ballroom, my little cousins ran over to hug my knees. Uncle George clapped my shoulder and asked about work. I smiled and greeted them softly, keeping my voice down so I would not pull any focus from the bride. Across the room, Ashley stood in her custom white gown. She saw the relatives gathered around me, and her practiced, radiant smile went entirely rigid. The trouble started right before the cake cutting. A sharp squeal of feedback cut through the music as Ashley grabbed the microphone and walked to the center of the dance floor. She announced that our grandmother's diamond bracelet had disappeared from the bridal suite. The room went completely silent. You could hear the rain tapping against the tall glass windows. Ashley turned and looked straight at me. She asked loudly if I had been upstairs in the bridal suite. I told her I had not even been on that floor. Ashley raised her voice, so every guest in the back row could hear her. The bride claimed I had always been jealous about those family diamonds, insisting I just wanted to ruin her perfect night because I resented her happiness. I did not cry. I did not drop to my knees and beg her to believe me. Instead, I held both my hands out away from my body. I told her if she really believed I took it, she needed to call the police right now and have them search my purse. Ashley did not reach for her phone. Instead, she locked eyes with the 2 security guards standing near the exit and gave a very subtle, sharp nod. Those guards did not ask questions, nor did they ask to check my bag. They marched straight over, grabbed me by the arms, and dragged me toward the exit. I asked them why nobody was searching my things if a crime had just been committed. The taller guard only grunted, stating they were instructed by the venue client to remove me from the private property immediately. Guests held up their phones to record the scene. Camera flashes illuminated the dark corners of the room. My mother, Nancy, stood right next to Ashley during the entire commotion. She did not say a single word to stop them. My dad tried to stand up from his chair to reach me, but he had recently suffered a mild stroke, and the sudden movement made him dizzy. Aunt Linda had to hold him down by his shoulders. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind me. I stood under the awning in the freezing autumn rain, rubbing my sore wrists while the cold seeped into my shoes. Aunt Linda slipped out a side door a minute later, holding her coat like a shield. I told her to go back inside and stay with Dad. He did not need the physical stress of a family war tonight. Before I walked to my car, I looked back through the tall glass windows. Ashley was not commanding the staff to lock down the room, nor was she crying over our grandmother's stolen legacy. The bride simply smoothed down the tulle of her skirt, took her new husband by the hand, and walked back to the center of the dance floor. "What sticks out to you the most?" Grant asked, pulling me back to my quiet kitchen. I pushed my cold coffee mug aside. She never wanted the bracelet back, she only wanted me gone. Grant did not argue. He just reached into the thick manila envelope and pulled out one more sheet of paper. It was a signed addendum to her official insurance statement. "Your sister did not merely say you stole it," Grant told me. "She signed a legal document stating she saw you leaving the bridal floor at 8:12. I stared at the security photo again. The one showing me walking into the building at 8:43. Ashley had not just made a mistake in her panic. She had written a lie with a specific timestamp. A lie prepared long before I even stepped out of the rain. Grant Mercer walked out of my apartment, and the moment the latch clicked into place, my cell phone started vibrating against the kitchen counter. It had not stopped ringing since Saturday night. Notifications lit up the screen with a steady, punishing rhythm. Several extended family members wanted to know if I was okay. A few cousins sent messages telling me to just return the bracelet so the family would not have to deal with a police investigation. I did not type a single response. When Aunt Linda called an hour later, I finally picked up. Her voice sounded thin and exhausted. She told me my father was asking for me and begged me to come over to their house. I closed my eyes, leaning my forehead against the cool refrigerator door. I am not coming over while Ashley is sitting in that living room. Setting that boundary felt awful, but I held firm. Tuesday morning arrived with the buzzing fluorescent lights of the community clinic where I worked. Staying busy usually helped me clear my head. I spent the first 3 hours organizing patient schedules and helping an elderly man named Mr. Henderson figure out his county transit pass. Around noon, I handed our young receptionist a small bakery box to celebrate her birthday. I was not trying to be a saint. Remembering small details about people simply made the days run smoother. The receptionist did not smile when she took the box. She looked down at her lap, then glanced at me with deep, uncomfortable pity. Someone had uploaded the video of security dragging me out of the ballroom to a local community group. My humiliation was no longer contained to our family. My face burned, and a tight knot formed in my stomach, but I refused to pack up my desk. I just went back to sorting medical supply invoices. Aunt Linda showed up at the clinic during my lunch break, carrying a brown paper bag from my favorite deli. We sat in the break room while the scent of warm roasted turkey filled the small space. "Ashley always hated that everyone in the family calls you first," Linda said, pushing a wrapped sandwich across the table. "She thinks you steal her spotlight on purpose." My jaw tightened. I have never wanted to compete with her. I just show up when people need help. Linda gave me a sad, knowing look. "You do show up. And you also like being the one everyone needs. You like fixing things." That observation stung because a small part of it was true. For years, I had quietly corrected my sister's mistakes. I covered a small credit card debt for her 2 years ago and fixed her damaged wedding invitations without complaining. I called it being a good sister. But maybe I had been using my competence to secure my place in the family. By absorbing her messes, I had helped Ashley avoid any real consequences. My phone buzzed again on the plastic table. A text from Ashley appeared on the screen. The message was perfectly constructed, designed to make her look like a generous victim. She wrote that if I returned the bracelet within 24 hours, she would not push this matter any further and would keep the police out of it. Anger flared hot and bright in my chest. My fingers hit the keyboard before I took a single breath to think. I typed back that I knew exactly where $8,400 had gone from our father's medical care account. I hit send. A second later, the reality of my mistake washed over me. I had just tipped off my sister that I was investigating the missing money. I wanted to show her she could not bully me, but I had only handed her a warning. When I got home that evening, my mother was waiting in the hallway outside my door. Nancy held a plastic container of homemade chicken soup, holding it out like a peace offering. I unlocked the door and let her step inside. Just apologize to her for causing a scene, Mom pleaded, setting the container on the counter. The wedding was supposed to be her perfect night. We can smooth this all over. I crossed my arms. Do you actually believe I stole from our grandmother? My mother refused to meet my eyes. She focused entirely on a spot on the kitchen wall. You are stronger than she is, Samantha. You always bounce back. Something cold settled behind my ribs. I am not taking a criminal accusation just because you think I can handle the damage. Nancy shifted her weight nervously. As she moved, her hand brushed against a small, ivory-colored makeup bag hanging from her wrist. Her fingers twitched, and she quickly slid the bag behind her back, hiding it from my view. I noticed the odd gesture immediately, though I had no idea what it meant. Before I could ask about the bag, she turned and walked out the door, leaving the soup behind. 10 minutes later, my phone rang again. It was Grant Mercer. The investigator skipped the polite greetings. Did you ever threaten to ruin your sister's wedding? I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. No. Why would you ask me that? Grant explained that the insurance company had requested the security logs from the venue. To justify her claim, Ashley had provided them with a screenshot of an old text message I sent her. The text read, "If you keep lying, the wedding will not hide it." My stomach dropped. I had sent that exact message 2 weeks ago, right after I noticed the missing medical funds. It was not a threat to ruin her reception. It was a warning about her lies. Ashley had saved my words and twisted them into a perfect motive for revenge. I sent that message, I told him, keeping my voice steady. But it had nothing to do with a bracelet. I believe you, Grant replied, because the venue manager just sent over their internal security instructions. My phone chimed with a new photo attachment from Grant. I tapped the screen and opened an image of a printed security log. There was my name, highlighted in yellow, placed on a list labeled "Remove on Bride's Signal." The timestamp on the document showed the venue staff received that instruction at 12:15 in the afternoon. My sister had ordered my removal 8 hours before the bracelet supposedly went missing. The smell of roasted espresso beans and wet wool filled the small cafe where Grant Mercer had asked to meet. Rain continued to wash down the large storefront windows, blurring the streetlights into glowing yellow smudges. The investigator took a sip from his dark mug and slid a printed incident report across the scratched wooden table. This document contained the official shift notes surrendered by the venue's security company. Grant explained in a calm, measured voice that event venues possess the legal right to remove unruly guests, which meant the guards were simply following client instructions on Saturday night. However, the specific directives they received made my sister's story completely unravel. The shift lead had written down that the bride warned them about a potential family disruption. The order was incredibly precise. If Ashley tapped her wrist twice, the guards were to escort me out of the building immediately. Staring at the typed words, the exact memory of that moment clicked into place. I pictured Ashley standing on the dance floor, looking right at the security team and tapping her arm. Heavy hands had fallen on my shoulders a second later. Nobody had mentioned checking my purse, and nobody had actually started searching the room for a stolen diamond. A sharp urge to track down those guards and demand they talk to the police hit me hard. Grant recognized the shift in my posture and immediately raised a hand, warning me to stay far away from the venue staff. Pressuring witnesses would only compromise the entire insurance investigation. A false timeline could easily be dismissed by a clever lawyer as a bridal panic attack, so we needed an airtight chain of evidence, not just one favorable discrepancy. For the very first time in my adult life, I forced myself to sit back and respect the boundaries of a process instead of rushing in to fix the problem myself. My cell phone rang later that afternoon while I was folding laundry in my quiet apartment. Daniel's name flashed across the screen. My new brother-in-law sounded completely exhausted, his voice rough and thin. He explained that Ashley was spiraling, pacing the floors and unable to sleep, entirely convinced I was launching a campaign to sabotage their marriage. Daniel quietly asked me to hold off on discussing my father's missing care funds until they returned from a short weekend trip away. Listening to his strained breathing, I realized Daniel had no idea what was actually happening. He did not know about the fraudulent insurance claim or the security logs sitting on my kitchen counter. I wanted to blurt out the truth about Ashley's secret gambling debts right then, just to break through the lies and make him see reality. But Grant had explicitly told me not to interfere. I agreed to give them space, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, and ended the call without defending myself. Hearing Daniel's voice had dragged my mind directly back to the rehearsal dinner the night before the wedding. We had all gathered in a crowded, overheated Italian restaurant. One of my young nephews had climbed right into my lap, refusing to sit in his own chair. Aunt Linda had hugged me tightly over the table, thanking me for driving her to a complicated medical appointment earlier that month. Then Daniel had raised a glass of sparkling cider, announcing to the room that I was the very first person in the family who truly made him feel welcome. Ashley had smiled at the table, but her knuckles were white as her fingers locked around the wrist wearing our grandmother's bracelet. She laughed, a brittle sound that barely parted her lips, and told the room that I could win over a crowd without even buying the drinks. Everyone around us thought it was a sweet compliment. Sitting alone in my bedroom, I finally recognized the deep, acidic resentment hiding inside that joke. A new text message chimed, pulling me out of the memory. It was from Erin, one of the bridesmaids. She wrote that she desperately wanted to stay out of a family war. But she distinctly remembered Ashley telling the security guards to stand near the exit doors hours before the reception even started. Erin admitted she was terrified of being dragged into a criminal fraud investigation. The older version of me would have called Erin instantly, using our shared history to coax a formal statement out of her. Instead, I typed a short reply, thanking her for the information and promising I would never give her name to the investigator. I left the decision entirely up to her. I was learning that I did not need to manipulate people's guilt to get to the truth. The next morning, Grant called me with a major update. He had legally obtained a copy of the direct text message Ashley sent to the security supervisor. The investigator read the words aloud over the phone. When I touch my wrist twice, remove my sister immediately. Do not let her argue in front of the guests. There was absolutely zero mention of a missing heirloom or a theft. The plan to humiliate me existed long before the public accusation in the ballroom. Grant paused, letting the heavy silence stretch over the phone line. He pointed out that the central question was no longer whether Ashley got the timeline wrong. The real question was why she needed me removed from the building so urgently. Before I could even formulate a theory, a new notification popped up on my screen. Daniel had sent a photograph without any greeting or context. It was a screenshot of a strange transaction on their shared credit card statement. The charge was dated exactly 5 weeks before the wedding. The billing description read, "Custom crystal bracelet replica. Customer photo match." 20 minutes after that text message arrived, a heavy knock rattled my apartment door. Daniel stood in the hallway, rain dripping from the hem of his jacket. He held a crumpled piece of paper in his hand. My brother-in-law pushed past me into the kitchen, dropping the printed credit card statement right onto the counter. "I am not stealing confidential documents," Daniel said, his voice tight. "My name is on that account. I have a legal right to look." He pointed at the charge from a theatrical supply company. The young school counselor desperately wanted his new wife to be innocent, explaining that Ashley claimed the replica was simply a custom gift for a bridesmaid. I looked at the vendor name, recognizing a business that manufactured stage jewelry from customer photographs. Without offering a judgment or trying to convince him, I simply took a picture of the statement and emailed it directly to Grant Mercer. My phone started vibrating before the email even finished sending. An unknown number flashed on the screen. When I answered, Ashley spoke in a low, furious whisper that made the hair on my arms stand up. "You are poisoning my husband against me," the bride hissed. "You have always loved playing the saint while you treat me like a complete disaster. Checking my bills, tracking my habits, hovering over my entire life." My throat closed up because her accusation carried a sharp sliver of truth. I had spent years using a condescending tone when she made mistakes. Reminding her about missed appointments and covering her small debts gave me a quiet sense of control, an easy way to feel responsible and needed. Recognizing my own flaw hurt deeply, but my past judgment did not put a stolen diamond in my purse. I hung up the phone without saying a single word. Daniel watched me set the device down. He sank onto a kitchen stool, taking off his glasses to rub his exhausted eyes. Slowly, he started piecing recent memories together aloud. He remembered offering to take the heirloom to a professional jeweler for cleaning a week before the ceremony. Ashley had completely panicked, insisting the fragile antique could never leave her wrist. During the rehearsal dinner, she had kept her right hand tucked under the table, swatting him away whenever he tried to touch the clasp. And then there were the phone calls. Strange, unsaved numbers had been calling her for weeks, sending her out of the room to answer in private. The sudden ringtone of a new call interrupted his thoughts. Grant Mercer needed a quick confirmation. The investigator had contacted the jewelry shop, and the owners agreed to preserve their records for an official inquiry. Grant would not hand me the confidential file, but he confirmed one crucial detail. The shop had produced a crystal replica based entirely on reference photos my sister provided. Ashley had prepared a fake diamond, and I had absolutely no idea where the real one had gone. Later that afternoon, the phone rang again. The caller ID showed my father's cell. The rhythmic hum of a physical therapy treadmill echoed in the background. "I do not believe you took your grandmother's bracelet," Robert told me. "Are you eating enough?" Tears threatened to spill over my eyelashes. For the first time in days, someone in my family offered absolute trust without demanding an explanation first. My dad took a labored breath, mentioning that Nancy was suddenly refusing to show him the recent statements for his own medical care account. He sounded frightened. I desperately wanted to march over to their house and demand the paperwork myself, but I forced my hands to unclench. I gently told him that I could not legally take documents from my mother, advising him to call the bank directly and request his own financial records. A barrage of alerts suddenly flooded my screen. Ashley had just posted a long paragraph in the main family group chat. She accused me of threatening to ruin her wedding and claimed I was actively trying to steal Daniel away from her. Several aunts and cousins replied with shocked emojis, their loyalty beginning to waver under her emotional performance. I typed out a massive paragraph detailing the staged jewelry and the security logs. My thumb hovered over the send button. Then, I erased the entire thing. I refused to perform on the stage she had built. Instead, I typed exactly 3 sentences. I did not take the bracelet. I am cooperating with the official investigation. I will not argue about evidence in a family chat. Quiet fell over my apartment until evening arrived. Caleb, the wedding videographer, left a voicemail asking me to call Grant immediately. The insurance investigator had requested raw footage from a secondary camera placed in the bridal suite, a camera Caleb had left running by mistake during lighting checks. Grant sent a single, silent video frame to my phone. The digital timestamp at the bottom read 7:58. My sister sat alone in the bridal suite, her fingers moving quickly as she unhooked the diamond bracelet from her own wrist. I stared at the screen, knowing I was still fighting highway traffic an hour away from the venue. The fluorescent lights hummed steadily overhead inside Grant Mercer's cramped office, casting long shadows across his cluttered desk. Caleb, the wedding videographer, sat nervously by the window while Daniel and I stood behind the investigator's chair, staring at the bright computer monitor. Grant clicked his mouse, pressing play on the raw footage Caleb had legally surrendered that morning. A secondary camera, set up on a tripod merely to capture the bridal makeup process, had been left running by mistake after the crew went downstairs. On the screen, the digital timestamp in the lower corner read 7:58. My sister stood in the center of the bridal suite, completely alone, her white gown glowing under the vanity lights. She unhooked the glittering bracelet from her wrist, her movements deliberate and calm, and carefully placed it inside a familiar ivory-colored makeup bag. A moment later, my mother stepped into the frame, reaching out to take the small pouch. Nancy paused, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. "Are you sure this is the one you want to wear?" Nancy asked, her voice caught clearly by the microphone pinned to a nearby chair. Ashley did not even look at our mother. "It only has to look right in pictures." Daniel reached across the desk and hit the spacebar, freezing the video instantly. He slowly removed his glasses, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes until his knuckles turned white. My brother-in-law did not scream, throw anything, or demand a divorce right there in the office. He just sat perfectly still in the guest chair, asking the empty air why his new bride would need a priceless family heirloom to merely look correct for photographs. A powerful urge to place a comforting hand on his shoulder washed over me, a deeply ingrained instinct to manage someone else's emotional pain. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, realizing that fixing this for him would only rob him of the truth. Watching that ivory bag on the screen triggered a sharp physical reaction in my chest. My mother had carried that exact pouch into my apartment just days ago when she brought me chicken soup, nervously shifting it out of sight when I questioned her loyalty. I reached for my cell phone, desperate to call Nancy and demand answers. Grant immediately placed his heavy hand over mine, shaking his head. The investigator warned me that confronting a person currently holding potential physical evidence could compromise the entire inquiry, instructing me to wait for the proper authorities to secure the item. The delay frustrated me endlessly, but I slid the phone back into my pocket, finally honoring the legal process over my desperate need for control. Later that afternoon, Grant brought an independent jewelry appraiser into the office to review the frozen video frames. The expert leaned close to the monitor, comparing the bright, pixelated image of the jewelry on screen to the official appraisal photographs submitted in my sister's insurance file. Because of the camera's distance across the room, nobody could read tiny engravings or spot microscopic repairs. However, the appraiser pointed a pen at the screen, noting that the physical shape of the clasp and the arrangement of the stones sitting right next to the locking mechanism looked entirely wrong. The item captured it. Liu. Grant pulled the true serial number directly from the insurance policy documents, relying on official paperwork rather than the blurry video. Armed with that unique identifier, the investigator submitted a formal query into a centralized database used by law enforcement and licensed pawnbrokers. I paced the length of his tiny office, asking for the addresses of nearby pawn shops so I could go look for the real diamonds myself. Grant flatly refused, reminding me that amateur interference only destroys valid cases. We had to wait for the system to work. The investigator made a formal phone call to my mother shortly after the appraiser left, leaving a stern voicemail requiring Nancy to contact his office regarding an active fraud inquiry. Panic clearly set in. Instead of calling Grant back, my mother dialed my number 10 minutes later, her voice trembling so hard the speakerphone rattled against the desk. She swore that Ashley had only borrowed the heirloom to resolve a temporary cash problem, promising to redeem the item the moment she collected her next sales commission at the furniture store. Nancy desperately insisted she only hid the truth to protect the sanctity of the wedding day, claiming nobody was supposed to get hurt. "Did you know the bracelet she wore down the aisle was fake?" I asked, gripping the edge of the wooden desk. Complete silence stretched across the telephone line. My mother did not answer, and her total inability to speak told me everything I needed to know. She had known the jewelry was a prop, and she had stood in the ballroom, watching security guards drag her oldest daughter out into the freezing rain without saying a single word. Grant ended the call just as his computer chimed with an incoming email alert. A licensed pawnbroker located 3 towns over had responded to the official database inquiry. The shop owner sent over a digitized copy of a transaction record matching the exact serial number of our grandmother's diamonds. "We are no longer investigating a missing item," Grant said, his voice dropping into a serious clinical tone. "This is a staged insurance fraud claim." The investigator turned his monitor toward me. The pawnshop had provided a still frame from their own security cameras, dated exactly 6 weeks before the wedding. There was Ashley, wearing her favorite green sweater, standing under the bright fluorescent lights of the shop. She placed the real diamond bracelet onto the glass counter, smiled at the clerk, and leaned forward to sign her own name on the contract. Dust hung in the pale afternoon light filtering through my parents' living room window. Grant Mercer sat on the edge of the floral sofa, keeping his posture stiff and professional. My father rested in his favorite armchair, breathing slowly, while I stood near the doorway. We were not here for a family visit. The investigator quietly explained to my mother that she could voluntarily surrender the item in question, or he would be forced to forward his findings to the proper authorities for a search warrant. Nancy avoided looking at any of us. The woman who had spent decades keeping our family looking perfect simply nodded, walked over to a stack of wedding keepsakes in the corner, and returned holding a familiar ivory-colored makeup bag. Her manicured fingers trembled as she pulled the zipper back, She reached inside the hidden lining and placed a glittering, incredibly fake diamond bracelet right onto the glass coffee table. Ashley promised she would redeem the real one after she got her next sales commission, Nancy whispered, staring at the cheap crystal. My mother insisted the bride only bought the replica so our grandmother could still be present in the wedding photographs. The excuse sounded absolutely absurd falling from her lips. Nancy admitted she knew the jewelry was a prop, but she had desperately convinced herself that no one would get hurt if Ashley just bought the original back quietly. You knew it was fake when she accused me in front of 200 people, I said, my voice rising higher than I intended. You stood right next to her, Mom. You let her build a criminal record around my name just to keep her comfortable. My father raised a shaking hand, asking us to stop shouting. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, realizing I was using all my old resentment to punish her in one single strike. Being right did not give me permission to be cruel. I do not want an apology that you think will calm me down, I told her, lowering my tone. I just need the actual truth. Robert shifted in his heavy armchair and reached into his sweater pocket. My father pulled out a folded stack of bank statements he had personally requested that morning. He placed the papers on the table, right next to the fake jewelry. The documents showed a transfer of $8,400 leaving his medical care account in late September, sent directly to a wedding event company. Ashley had used the emergency access Nancy had given her months ago. My mother covered her mouth with her hand, a quiet sob escaping her throat. She confessed she discovered the missing money weeks before the ceremony, but she let Ashley promise to pay it back instead of telling my father. Staring at those bank logs, a sickening realization washed over me. The public framing in the ballroom was never just about getting insurance money. Ashley needed everyone to think I was a thief, so that any future questions I asked about our father's missing funds would look like bitter retaliation. Grant pulled out a small notepad, asking if my sister had communicated anything else on the day of the ceremony. Nancy wiped her eyes and mentioned a voicemail from the morning of the wedding, a message she had completely ignored because her phone was set to silent during the bridal preparations. The investigator asked her to play it aloud. Nancy picked up her cell phone, pressed a few buttons, and placed the device in the center of the coffee table. A burst of static filled the quiet living room, followed immediately by my sister's voice. Ashley sounded entirely sober and terrifyingly calm. "Mom, stop worrying," the bride said through the small speaker. "I've already handled Samantha. Once people think she took the bracelet, nobody is going to listen when she starts asking questions about the medical account." A heavy pause followed on the recording, filled only with the sound of a zipper closing in the background. Then, Ashley's tone shifted from calculated planning into raw, unvarnished bitterness. She complained that even while she was getting her hair done for her own wedding, 3 different aunts had stopped by the suite just to ask if I had arrived yet. The recording clicked off, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Robert did not scream at his wife. He simply looked at Nancy, his expression breaking into deep, quiet devastation, and asked why she always believed I could survive any amount of betrayal just because I caused fewer problems than my sister. Nancy had absolutely no answer for him. I watched my dad lean back into his chair, finally understanding that keeping the peace had only created a family entirely built on lies. Grant stepped forward and carefully placed the fake jewelry into a transparent evidence bag. He instructed my mother to back up the voicemail and warned all of us not to alter any files. I kept my hands firmly by my sides, refusing to touch the crystal replica. The investigator zipped his briefcase closed, but the final words of that audio recording continued to echo loudly in my head. Before the call ended, my sister had made one last promise to our mother. By the end of tonight, Ashley had whispered, they will finally look at her the way they have always looked at me. I stood frozen in my parents' living room. The insurance money and the stolen medical funds were just convenient benefits. The real target had never been the jewelry. The target had always been me. Erin, one of the bridesmaids from the wedding, sent a series of screenshots to Grant Mercer's office early the following morning. The young woman wanted nothing to do with a formal legal battle, but her conscience had finally caught up with her. She forwarded a string of private messages Ashley had typed during the frantic hours before the ceremony. My sister had complained bitterly in the group chat because older relatives kept asking if I had arrived yet. Daniel had checked his watch 3 times, wondering where I was. and several children had loudly asked why I was missing from the portraits. One particular sentence stood out among the complaints. "She does not even try," Ashley had written to the bridesmaids. That is the part I hate. Sitting alone at my kitchen table, I let my mind drift back across the years, looking for the root of that deep, festering resentment. I did not rely on grand memories of heroic sacrifices. Instead, 3 small moments floated to the surface. I remembered sitting in a sterile hospital waiting room for 2 hours with Aunt Linda, keeping her company while her husband was stuck in severe highway traffic. I remembered noticing an allergic reaction warning for my young nephew and quietly swapping his dinner plate before anyone else noticed the hazard. And I remembered dialing Daniel's phone number after his very first family dinner, just to make sure he navigated the dark rural roads back to his apartment safely. These were not grand, heroic deeds. They were just quiet habits of attention. They explained why people naturally gravitated toward me without ever turning me into a saint. Aunt Linda dropped by my apartment later that afternoon, bringing a warm loaf of banana bread and a harsh dose of reality. She sat across from me, her expression gentle but serious. Linda admitted the family genuinely loved me because I paid attention to their lives, but she also pointed out a hard truth. Everyone had grown entirely too comfortable leaning on me because I never knew how to say no. I had allowed myself to carry everyone else's burdens because I secretly loved the feeling of being the reliable one, the indispensable anchor of the household. I swallowed hard, tasting the bitter accuracy of her words. I confess that I had actually known about Ashley's secret online gambling relapse weeks before the wedding, yet I chose to stay silent instead of warning Daniel. I had been terrified of being labeled the toxic troublemaker who ruined a family milestone, convincing myself I could quietly manage the disaster afterward. My silence had only cleared a wide path for Ashley to carry out her plan. Daniel arrived at my apartment shortly after Linda left. He had spent hours reviewing the credit card statements and cross-referencing the timeline of the fake crystal replica. Ashley had wept hysterically when he confronted her, alternating between begging for forgiveness and insisting that I was the mastermind who had manipulated the entire family against her. When Daniel asked why she specifically targeted me with such a vicious accusation, my sister finally let the mask slip. She admitted she always believed I secretly wanted everyone to think I was morally superior to her. My brother-in-law looked entirely defeated, the weight of a shattered marriage pressing down on his shoulders. He announced he had packed his bags and moved into a friend's spare room, though he had not yet filed for a public divorce. The final trap dropped into my inbox before evening arrived. Ashley sent an urgent message demanding a formal family meeting at our mother's house on Sunday afternoon. She claimed she needed to end my malicious campaign once and for all, promising to present definitive proof that I had manipulated the investigator, Daniel, and Nancy. She explicitly instructed me to come alone and bring the original manila envelope Grant had given me, hoping to steal back the physical evidence and rewrite the narrative one last time. Grant strongly advised me against attending, warning that walking into an emotionally charged room of relatives could easily compromise our legal position. A consulting attorney confirmed I could attend only if I brought strictly controlled, verified copies of the documents, ensuring I never altered or misrepresented a single fact. I weighed the choices carefully. If I stayed home, Ashley would fill the empty room with fresh lies. If I went just to watch her squirm, I would sink right down to her level. I decided to walk through those doors with a single, clear objective. I would show the family the hard evidence one single time, and then I would refuse to participate in their circus ever again. My phone buzzed against the counter with a final, taunting demand from the bride. Come alone. Bring the envelope. By Sunday, everyone will know what you really are. I placed the device flat on the wooden surface, refusing to let her panic dictate my heartbeat. I typed a single, calm sentence in response. They will. The afternoon sun beat down through the tall elm trees outside my mother's suburban house, casting long, fractured shadows across the driveway. My fingers curled around the edge of a plain manila folder resting on the passenger seat of my car. Inside that folder sat only the verified, legally permitted copies of the insurance timeline, the security team instructions, the replica store invoice, a single transcribed frame of the raw video footage, and the pawn shop transaction record. The originals remained safely locked away in Grant Mercer's office. I had left nothing to chance. Before stepping out of the car, I spent 5 minutes drafting a long, blistering speech in my head. I wanted to list every single time Ashley had lied, every holiday she had ruined, and every quiet humiliation she had inflicted upon me over the past decade. Reading those imaginary sentences back to myself, a cold weight settled in my chest. If I walked into that house shouting about our entire shared history, I would simply turn a fraud investigation into a petty sibling brawl. I ripped the mental script to pieces, keeping only 3 fundamental questions in my mind. Where was the real diamond? Why had the security guards been instructed to remove me hours before the necklace supposedly vanished? And why did my sister need the entire family to view me as a thief? My father's sedan was parked near the garage. Robert had insisted on attending the family gathering despite his fragile health. When I called him earlier that morning to suggest he stay home and rest, my dad had quietly reminded me that protecting him from uncomfortable truths had become the primary excuse for years of family deception. I agreed to bring him, making sure to pack his heart medication and a small bottle of water in my coat pocket, while still refusing to make decisions on his behalf. Stepping through the front door felt like walking into an old theater right before the curtain rose. Nancy had arranged the living room furniture into 2 distinct, accidental camps. Ashley sat perched on the edge of the floral armchair right next to our mother, wearing a plain beige sweater instead of her bridal whites, carefully curating the image of a persecuted victim. Daniel stood awkwardly near the brick fireplace, his arms crossed tight over his chest, refusing to make eye contact with his wife. Aunt Linda and Uncle George sat on the far sofa, their expressions tight with a mixture of anxiety and exhaustion. I walked into the center of the room alone, exactly as commanded, and laid the manila folder flat on the coffee table. Ashley did not wait for me to take a breath. She launched into her defense with a polished, theatrical performance that she must have rehearsed for hours. My sister pointed a trembling finger at me, telling the room that I had always thrived on being the indispensable martyr. She claimed I had bullied the insurance investigator, manipulated Daniel into doubting her sanity, and deliberately engineered a false narrative to punish her for having a happy wedding. She looked directly at Nancy, pleading for validation. "She has always been jealous of the life I built," Ashley cried, her voice cracking with practiced perfection. She could not stand watching me get married. I did not interrupt her. I let the accusations hang in the air, refusing to raise my voice. When she finally paused to catch her breath, I looked across the coffee table and gave a very simple, measured response. "I was wrong to keep Daniel's life from him," I said, my voice steady and quiet, "and I was wrong to think I could manage your choices behind the scenes. But none of those mistakes put a missing diamond in my purse." The calm admission completely disarmed her. Ashley blinked, her rehearsed outrage stuttering for a fraction of a second before she twisted back toward our mother, demanding that Nancy tell everyone about my controlling behavior over the years. I turned my gaze to my mother. "Do you have anything you want to say, Mom?" Nancy remained seated right beside Ashley. She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, her shoulders hunched under an invisible weight. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably on the couch, interpreting my mother's silence as a continuation of her lifelong habit of choosing the youngest child, no matter the cost. A familiar, sharp ache bloomed behind my ribs, but I refused to let it turn into a plea for affection. I was done begging for a fair place at a table built on favoritism. Ashley smiled, a thin, triumphant curve of her lips. "Even Mom knows the truth," she whispered to the room. Instead of shrinking back, Nancy slowly stood up from the armchair. She did not walk over to my side of the room. Instead, she crossed the floor toward the small television stand in the corner, her movements stiff and mechanical. My mother picked up a small digital speaker she had borrowed from a neighbor and placed it on top of the wooden cabinet. "Play the message first," Nancy said, her voice barely louder than a dry leaf scraping across concrete. Ashley spun around in her seat, her face draining of color in a single heartbeat. "Mom, what are you doing? Turn that off." Nancy ignored her, pressing play on the connected phone. The tinny audio recording of the voicemail Ashley left on the morning of the wedding filled the quiet living room. "Once they think Samantha stole it, nobody will listen when she starts asking about the money." The room went entirely, deathly silent. You could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen down the hall. Ashley bolted straight up from the armchair, lunging toward the speaker like a cornered animal. She pointed a shaking finger at our mother, her carefully maintained mask of innocence shattering completely into raw, ugly panic. "You were supposed to delete that!" Ashley screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet house. The tiny digital speaker hummed in the center of the living room, replaying the final seconds of that wedding morning voicemail until the audio cut out completely. Ashley stood frozen beside the television cabinet, her chest heaving as she stared at our mother with absolute betrayal. No one in the room moved. The heavy silence lasted long enough for the distant sound of traffic outside to bleed through the closed windows. Ashley tried to recover, her hands fluttering toward her face as her voice shifted into a thin, defensive whine. She claimed she had only recorded those words during a moment of intense panic, insisting the stress of the wedding had made her say things she never truly meant. I did not raise my voice to argue about her feelings. I simply reached into the manila folder on the coffee table and pulled out the venue's security log. "Then let us look at what happened before I arrived," I said, laying the papers flat on the wood. I pointed to the two conflicting timestamps. I reminded the room that the official insurance statement claimed the heirloom vanished at 8:10 in the evening. Then, I held up the digital photograph from the parking garage entrance, showing my car pulling into the venue at 8:43. Aunt Linda leaned forward, peering closely at the printed numbers, and read the arrival time aloud to everyone. Ashley crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her face flushing a deep, angry red. She stammered that she must have made a simple mistake with the clock because the chaotic reception had rattled her nerves. "Then let us talk about the instructions you gave the guards before the guests even walked through the front doors," I replied, sliding the signed security directive across the table. Uncle George picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the typewritten words where the shift lead confirmed my sister had ordered my immediate removal the moment she tapped her wrist twice. Ashley spun around to face him, shouting that she only gave those instructions because she knew I was angry about old family arguments and wanted to prevent a scene. "You did not order security to stop a fight," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through her excuses. "You needed me off the property so nobody could ask questions while you staged a theft." Frustrated, cornered, and entirely out of fabricated explanations, Ashley lunged across the coffee table and knocked the manila folder onto the floor. Papers scattered across the rug. Instead of screaming back or diving to pick them up, I reached down and lifted a transparent plastic evidence bag containing the crystal replica my mother had surrendered earlier that afternoon. Nancy kept her head bowed, refusing to look at any of us as I placed the fake necklace right on the center of the table. An independent appraiser compared the wedding footage to the official insurance documents, I told the room, keeping my tone perfectly even. "The clasp and the stone arrangement do not match our grandmother's heirloom. This is a theatrical prop." George stared at the glittering glass under the living room lights, then looked up at my mother with absolute disbelief in his eyes. He asked Nancy where the real diamond was. Before my mother could form an answer, I dropped the final piece of evidence onto the glass table. It was the digitized transaction record and the still frame from the pawn shop counter, dated 6 weeks before the wedding, showing Ashley's own signature at the bottom of the contract. Daniel stepped out from the shadows near the fireplace. He walked slowly toward the coffee table, his eyes locked on the pawn shop document bearing his wife's legal name. He looked at Ashley, the man who had promised to spend his life with her just 3 days before, and asked a single, quiet question. "You were going to collect the insurance payout on a piece of jewelry you hawked a month before we got married?" Daniel asked. Ashley burst into tears, her theatrical composure completely shattering. She grabbed the edge of the table, insisting she only pawned it to clear a temporary debt and fully intended to redeem the diamonds before anyone noticed. She screamed that she was forced into it, because no one in the family ever took her financial struggles seriously. Then she turned her fury directly toward me, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "You already had everyone wrapped around your finger. Even on my wedding day, before I even walked down the aisle, all the relatives were asking when Samantha would arrive, checking if Samantha approved of the flowers, making sure Samantha had a seat." I held her gaze, refusing to flinch away from the ugliness in her expression. "So you wanted them to hate me?" Ashley did not say yes, but the heavy, suffocating silence that filled the room answered the question more clearly than any confession could have. She hated that my presence in the family required no performance, no artificial charm, and no financial padding. Daniel slowly slid his gold wedding band off his finger. He set the ring down on the wooden coffee table right next to the fake crystal bracelet, his movements deliberate and entirely void of anger. He told Ashley he could not stay married to someone who valued human collateral so cheaply, confirming he would leave immediately to stay with a friend and contact a divorce attorney. He did not yell, and he did not make empty threats. He simply walked out the front door, leaving her standing alone in the center of the room. The quiet that followed was profound. No one delivered an emotional speech, and no one stood up to applaud. Aunt Linda was the first to move, standing up from the sofa and walking over to sit on the empty armchair directly beside me. George followed her, taking a seat nearby. One of my young cousins reached down, picked up his phone, which had been recording the confrontation, switched the device off, and tossed it onto the couch to refuse part in the spectacle. My father pushed himself up from his armchair using both hands, walking slowly across the carpet until he lowered his frail body into the chair right next to mine. One by one, the rest of the relatives shifted their positions, moving away from the side of the room where Ashley stood. Nancy remained trapped in the middle of the floor, standing entirely by herself. My mother finally broke down, confessing to the entire family that she had known about the pawnshop transaction, that she had helped hide the replica, and that she had chosen to protect her youngest daughter by letting the oldest take the fall. Ashley looked around the living room, watching the familiar faces physically distance themselves from her deceit. She threw her hands up in the air and screamed at the top of her lungs that everyone in the room was choosing me over her. I looked at my sister, letting the truth settle over the space between us. "No," I said quietly. "They are choosing what you did over what you said." Before Ashley could launch into another round of screaming, my cell phone began to vibrate loudly against the coffee table. The screen displayed Grant Mercer's name. Following the investigator's instructions from earlier that morning, I pressed the speakerphone button and laid the device flat on the wood. Grant's voice filled the quiet living room, steady and official. He announced that the insurance company had officially reviewed all newly submitted evidence, formally rejected the theft claim for fraudulent misrepresentation, and transferred the complete investigative file to the appropriate legal authorities for statutory review. Ashley froze, her breath catching in her throat as she heard every single word echo through the speaker. For the very first time since she set her plan in motion, the consequences of her actions had slipped entirely out of her control, leaving her standing in a room full of people who finally saw the unvarnished truth. Over the weeks that followed that explosive family meeting, the legal system ground forward without any theatrical police raids or sudden dramatic arrests. The insurance company officially rejected the fraudulent claim. The local authorities reviewed the transferred files, examining the pawnshop transaction records and the financial statements from my father's care account. By May of 2026, after months of steady negotiation through a court-appointed attorney, Ashley accepted a formal legal resolution that included mandatory restitution payments, supervised probation, community service hours, and a court-ordered gambling addiction treatment program. She did not serve a multi-year prison sentence for an unfulfilled insurance claim, but the public weight of her criminal record and the absolute loss of her financial safety net delivered a permanent reality check. Daniel moved out of their shared apartment permanently on the very evening of our confrontation. Following weeks of private counseling and legal consultations, he officially filed for divorce. He did not attempt to build a romantic relationship with me, choosing instead to keep our interactions strictly respectful, distant, and centered entirely around winding down shared administrative ties. He cooperated fully with the investigators by providing joint credit card statements, ensuring that the image of a flawless marriage my sister had tried so desperately to protect vanished completely. My father and mother permanently locked Ashley out of any administrative access to the medical care account. To cover a portion of the funds our younger sister had drained for her wedding vendors, Nancy was forced to sell her newer sedan and significantly cut back on her household expenses. I did not accept a single penny of financial inheritance or large property transfers from my parents. The $4,000 I had lent Ashley months earlier was officially rolled into her court-ordered restitution plan, though I never sat around waiting for those checks to arrive. Nancy came to my apartment one Tuesday evening, arriving without her usual homemade soup or any polished excuses. She sat at my small kitchen table, looked me directly in the eye, and clearly apologized for every single time she had sacrificed my well-being to keep the peace. She did not demand immediate forgiveness, and I did not offer it on the spot. I agreed to attend a few structured family therapy sessions with her, provided she maintained total accountability for her actions. I did not, however, hand her a spare key to my front door, nor did I resume answering every frantic phone call she attempted to place. Ashley called me late one afternoon from the lobby of her mandated counseling center. Her voice sounded thin, fractured by months of isolation, complaining that the rest of the family had completely abandoned her. She demanded that I step in and convince everyone to forgive her. Forgiveness is not the same as giving you your old place back, I told her, keeping my tone entirely level. She sobbed that I had won everything. I reminded her that nobody wins when a family has to discover the truth through an insurance fraud investigation. When she asked if I still considered her my sister, I answered honestly. Blood relation does not wipe away the destruction of a crime, and I would only speak to her when she stopped demanding that other people fix the consequences of her choices. Now, in July of 2026, roughly 9 months after those cold October nights began, our family gathered in my parents' living room to celebrate my father's birthday. There was no rented ballroom, no expensive jewelry display, and no rehearsed speeches about perfection. I arrived carrying a simple homemade lemon cake that my dad loved. One of my young nephews bolted across the carpet to wrap his arms around my waist, but when the seating at the dining table turned out to be short by one chair, I deliberately stayed seated and let the rest of the relatives solve the problem themselves instead of jumping up to fix it. Aunt Linda noticed the change and offered a warm, approving smile from across the room. I finally understood that I could be deeply loved by the people around me without having to shoulder the weight of everyone else's disasters. Robert walked over and placed a small velvet box on the table, sliding it gently toward my hands. Inside sat the antique diamond bracelet, fully recovered and legally returned through the proper channels after the investigation closed. He asked if I wanted to keep it for myself. I gently pushed the box back across the wood, shaking my head. I suggested we place the heirloom inside a secure bank safety deposit box with clear, transparent documentation, so that it remained a shared family history rather than a prize to be won. Touching the repaired clasp, I thought back to the crystal replica shining under the wedding lights. The true value of our lives had never been locked inside precious stones. It rested entirely in the quiet comfort of knowing that love and responsibility no longer shared the same definition. My phone vibrated softly against the tabletop, lighting up with a familiar incoming caller ID. I glanced down at the screen, saw my sister's name flashing in the dim light, and turned the device face down without a single flicker of guilt. I still answered when love called my name. I just stopped answering when guilt used the same voice. When you spend your whole life acting as the shock absorber for everyone else's mistakes, you start to believe that keeping the peace is your personal job. But protecting people from the natural wreckage of their own choices is not kindness. It is just a way of enabling destruction. True care means standing by the people you love while letting them face the full weight of reality, because nobody ever learns how to build a genuine life if someone else is always there to sweep up the broken glass. Have you ever caught yourself carrying the heavy burden of someone else's guilt, wondering how long you could keep holding it up before it finally broke you?